How do we help a child with speech and language delays when we don't know where to start? I'm Carrie Clark, and on today's episode of the Speech and Language Kids podcast, I'm going to be sharing you a story called, I'm going to call it Arianna's story. That's not her real name, but this is the real story of one of my clients and how we figured out what to work on for a preschooler who was difficult to understand, had some speech and language delays. So that is what we're going to be going over today. I'm going to share her story with you as a case study, and I'll walk you through the process of how we figured out what to work on and how we addressed her particular challenges. So welcome if you are new to our podcast. I am recording this live inside the Hub, which is our membership site over at hub.speechandlanguagekids.com. I see Ola in here with me. Welcome. We have a chat, so those of you who are joining me live, you can pop over to the chat and say hello if you'd like and answer questions. And if you are listening to this as a podcast and you would like to participate in our live recordings, you can hop over into the Hub. We have free plans, and our podcast recordings are available for the free plan membership as well as our full plan. Hey, Cynthia, Tiffany, Jenny, Tondaleo, welcome. All right, you guys can pop over and ask questions as we go along in the chat. Okay, so today I want to talk about preschool speech and language, and in particular, a little one named Arianna. Again, I'm changing the names for privacy, but we're going to call her Arianna today, and she is a client I worked with at a rural school district near me where I was going in as a contract SLP. I was only there one day a week, so that whole piece of trying to figure out what to work on can be a challenge when you are not in the building all the time, communicating with those staff and being around the child. So this is the story of how we went through the process of figuring all that out. Hi, Tiffany. Welcome, guys. A whole bunch of you. Awesome. Okay, so over the course of the last couple of months, you've probably heard me start to talk about the framework and the systems that we're creating inside the Hub for basically taking all of these ideas that were in my head and that I've been sharing in blog posts and podcasts and worksheets and putting it all together in one big framework, one system that makes this whole process easy. It makes the decision-making easy, and it gives us a guide when we are going through and trying to figure out how to help these children with speech and language delays in the most efficient way possible and the most functional way possible. Because test scores are not what we're looking for, right? We're looking for real, meaningful progress on communication skills. And so that is what I've been working on, and that is what is now available in full inside the Speech and Language Kids Hub. So if you'd like to check any of the pieces out, you can hop over, grab a free membership. We've got the first several steps there for free, including our screening checklists and our progress monitoring tools, which are a huge piece of this where do we start process, okay? So let me tell you about Arianna. She was 4 years old when I started working with her. She had qualified the previous year through a speech language evaluation, and a few areas were identified, but in general, it was people describing her as, we just can't understand what she's saying. She's really hard to understand. And so if any of you have worked with a preschooler who's hard to understand, there's a lot that goes into it, right? It's not just speech sounds. It's not just phonology. It's not just language. There's all these different parts that are all working together to make it so that that child is hard to understand. So the very first thing that we do with the SLK framework and when we are looking at how to help a new child is that we need to start with figuring out which area of communication that they're struggling in. And when I say area, I'm talking about speech, language, voice, fluency, these big areas, okay? So speech is the actual pronunciation of speech sounds, and then language is the words we use and how we put them together and how we use those words, right? So it's the actual language piece. And then fluency would be stuttering, repetitions, getting stuck on words, the flow of speech. And then we have things like your voice, which is your voice quality. We have social communication, how you use your language to interact socially with others. And then functional communication, which is are we able to get our basic wants and needs met by communicating with others? Okay, so those are our 6 areas that we look at with any child who's coming into speech language services. So for Arianna, we went through the different areas. I looked at the evaluation, I talked to the staff, and it looked like the main 2 areas impacted for her were speech sounds and her language skills. So she was definitely missing some speech sounds. She was definitely having some phonological processing, which we'll get into that too. But it was more than just the pronunciation. When it got down to the words she was using, she was also having trouble using grammatical markers and creating full, complete sentences that weren't leaving out words. And so that all was playing into her challenges with being understood by others. She was trying to communicate with us, but it was very hard to figure out what she was trying to say. Okay, so first step is the screening checklist. We narrowed it down to the speech sound area and the language area. All of the other areas seemed pretty good. I will say she was having some trouble with some social interactions, but the social piece was really coming down to the intelligibility piece, right? So it wasn't that she didn't know how to talk to others or how to make friends or how to ask for help. Those pieces were there. It's just that no one could understand them. So yes, there were some social language impairments, but they were impacts, not impairments, excuse me, social language impacts, but they were due to the speech and the language. And so that was part of this evaluation process, is figuring out, okay, where are the major impacts that if we were to help in those areas, everything would be easier. The communication would get better, right? And that's what it's all about, is figuring out what's going to have the most impact for this child. All right. So we narrowed down the areas. Okay. So the step 2 then of the SLK framework is to use the progress monitoring checklist that we have inside the hub to narrow down to specific subsets of skills or specific approaches that would be most appropriate to help that child. So the 2 that we did for Arianna were the speech sound area and the language area. So when you get into the hub, you will see that I have progress monitoring checklists where you can go through and check the specific skills and areas that the child is struggling with, okay? So for speech, we did this for Arianna, and we found that most of her speech sound problems were in the section that we call phonological processing. And that is entire groups of sound problems. It's these patterns, these speech sound patterns that are impaired as opposed to the individual sounds. So for example, Arianna dropped all sounds off of the ends of words. All final consonants were not there. So instead of cat, she would say ka, all right? The other one that we found was very strong with her was velar fronting, where she would make her K and G sounds as T and D sounds. So instead of cat being cat, it was actually ta, because she was producing that k sound up at the front of the mouth as a t sound, okay? So those were the 2 phonological processes that stood out the most. They are also some of the earliest to leave phonological processes, meaning that we expect to see those go away as the child gets older, and those are some of the first ones to go away, and she was still holding on to those. So those were the 2 that I specifically was looking at, but we did notice that it was phonological processes as opposed to a lisp or an R problem or just a single sound that she was struggling with. It was these whole classes of sounds, okay? So that was where we identified the biggest struggle for speech sounds. Then we did the same thing with language, because there's a lot of different areas of language as well, right? We have asking and answering questions, sequencing and retelling, sentence and grammar, being able to tell a narrative, tell a story, right? There's all these different areas of language that we have to look at. And when we went through the evaluation and we looked at those areas for Arianna, the one that stood out to me the most was the syntax and grammar, because she was using what we call very telegraphic speech. So that means, if you can imagine an old telegraph where you were paying by the letter, so you would leave out the words that weren't the big important ones, right? So instead of I'm coming home to see the cat, you would say coming home cat, I guess. I don't know. But you would leave out some of those smaller words that are the grammatical markers or those little functional words that don't make a huge impact to the meaning of the sentence, okay? So that's what she was doing. She was simplifying speech by only including the main content words, usually just the noun and the verb, and leaving out everything else, okay? So that made a huge impact on her being understood. Yes, she was also having trouble answering questions. Yes, she couldn't tell you a story to save her life. But these other things were bigger, right? The speech sounds, we needed those there because we can't understand the words she does have. We also needed to fill in some of those gaps so that her sentences were long enough that we could understand them. And that comes before being able to tell a story or even asking and answering questions, right? So when we are looking at these kids that have a lot of impairments, a lot of areas that they're struggling with, we need to prioritize the skills that are going to help them the most, the quickest. And so for Arianna, we decided it was those phonological processes and creating full sentences using the grammatical markers or whatever was missing to fill in those sentences. And then once we had that, then it would have been much easier to work on asking and answering questions and sequencing and retelling and all of those other skills. But we needed full sentences that we could understand first. Does that make sense? So those of you who are with me in here and live in the hub, hop over to the chat and tell me, does that make sense? Are you following? Do you see that logic, right? Of this is how we need to figure out what to work on first so that we can build a foundation, because that will make it easier to work on all of those other skills. For all we knew at this point, Arianna could be asking and answering questions appropriately, but we couldn't understand her well enough to understand, to know. All right, Wanda says, yes, makes sense. Awesome, good. Okay, so that's step 2 then, right, is identifying the sub areas, these smaller subsets of skills within the larger areas, and that's what we selected. So from there, our next step then is to decide what specific skills we're going to work on. And so for my framework inside the hub, we have these therapy pathways where you can say, okay, the child is struggling with this, and it will break it down into beginner level, intermediate level, and advanced level. So for phonological processing, that's a pathway, the phonological processing pathway. And there's the beginning phonological processes, which include final consonant deletion and velar fronting. Those are the ones that she needed to work on the most, right? And then there's some more advanced phonological processes that we could work on later. But right now we're at the beginning level of the phonological processing pathway. And then from there, we can say, okay, what specific skills do we want to target in therapy to support that? And that was her final consonant deletion and her velar fronting. Okay, so those are the 2 skills that we picked. Then for the language, we were looking at the syntax and grammar pathway. And again, that's broken out into these levels. So we had, okay, beginner level. Here are some very basic beginner grammar and syntax things that we want to include. We started with some of those easy ones, trying to get some of those grammatical markers in there or some of those smaller words so that we could build longer sentences, okay? And so I'm trying to remember, I think we started with an ing, the present progressive ing. So jumping, dancing, we started with that one. And I'm trying to remember what some of the other ones were. But regardless, we chose a couple of those grammatical markers that we wanted to work on that are the earlier developing ones and are easier to learn, okay? So now I have my list of skills, right? So this is that decision-making process. We go through, we pick the areas, we pick the sub-areas, we follow those pathways, and that leads us to the specific skills we want to teach. Now it's just a matter of running our therapy, which I know is much easier said than done. But for Arianna, I was able to grab our therapy plans for final consonant deletion, for velar fronting, and then let's say present progressive verbs, because I know that was one of the ones we were hitting. And then I had my therapy schedule all laid out. I knew how many minutes I was seeing her. Like I said, I was only in this school once a week, so it was just once a week I would work with her. I tried a couple different scheduling because she was not really, I think I had 30 or 45 minutes, and she couldn't always sit for that long because she was 4, right? And that's how it works. So I did do some where I'd grab her once in the morning, once in the afternoon, or I'd just grab her for like 5 minutes and we'd work on a couple of things, and then I'd do a longer session later. So I played with the scheduling. But basically what we ended up doing is kind of working on both. So we worked a little bit on the speech sounds and a little bit on the language, and we would kind of pop back and forth. Some days would be more language heavy, some days would be more speech heavy. But since I was working on both, I was also able to incorporate them together, right? And since she was 4, we did a lot of play. So we worked on a lot of things through play. And that would look like I would let her choose something out of my therapy bag, or in the room we had a space where we could make some choices about things to play with. So she could choose whatever she wanted to play with. And then within that activity, I would be modeling and prompting for either the present progressive ing, or for our final consonants, or for those velar sounds. Sometimes we would just be making the velar sound while we were doing things with the toys. And as long as we worked it into the play, she was happy to do that. She loved doing that. And then she had another friend with her in therapy that I pulled who had different goals. And that child's goals were more about asking and answering questions and understanding stories and retelling. So we also usually included a book activity, a storybook activity in the session where I would read, and then I would have them both kind of doing different things. So the one friend, I would be asking her questions and having her answer those, and I would be prompting with the WH words and all of those. But with Arianna, it was, I would say, what is she doing? And we'd be, she is jumping, or whatever that language skill is that she was working on, I would be modeling and asking and prompting, right? And then also monitoring those final consonants. And so as we were talking and answering questions and reading this story together, if something came up and she said something without a final consonant, I would say, oh, listen, that word has a sound at the end. Listen, cat. Let's say it like this, cat, and have her repeat it, okay? So all of these things kind of worked in together. I know inside the hub, we have these therapy plans that are so nicely laid out. Oh, if you're only working on final consonant deletion, here's the page. But it's obviously more complicated than that, right? We're weaving this all together, and we're working on it through play or through these activities that are more engaging than just sitting down and drill and practice, right? Especially at that preschool level. So that's what we did. We worked on these. I would send things home as homework. I would talk to the classroom teacher and say, hey, we're working on our G sounds today. We did a lot of guzz. You guys can work on that too. So making sure we had that team collaboration as well. And as she started to progress and started to make progress on those things, we were able to include some different language targets. We were able to work on some harder sounds. But that's kind of how we flowed through this process. That's how we start with, here's a child who's hard to understand, and we find ways to narrow it down to what are those specific areas that are going to make the most impact for that child. All right? Okay, so let me hear, for those of you who are inside with the hub, do you have any questions on that? Or do you have any similar kids that you're working with that have some speech and language challenges at preschool level? So we're going to focus on preschool today. And you guys can pop those into the chat. Tell me a little bit about what's going on with that preschooler. And I can run you through this same process of, okay, let's look what therapy pathway would be appropriate. So you guys can pop in and type those in as well. All right. So while you guys are typing, I am going to kind of talk you through what some of those pathways are in the hub, because basically the pathways are a specific challenge that a child might be having. So we have a pathway for all of the common ones that we hit, and I like to make sure that we keep these as functional as possible. So that by that I mean an everyday communication skill that child is going to face. Not something that they didn't do right on the standardized testing, right? But actual functional skills that they're struggling with. So for our speech sound pathways, we have our articulation, which is one sound at a time, or we have phonology, which is the one we chose for Arianna, or there's one called motor speech. So this is for our children with apraxia of speech, or any type of motor problem where they're not able to physically get the sounds out and coordinated to make words. And what that ends up sounding like is very inconsistent speech sound errors. So if she had trouble putting together more than a couple sounds together to make a word, or every time she tried to say those words, they came out a little different, then we might have looked at a motor speech pathway. And then the other pathway I have for speech sounds is the mumbling pathway. So this is for our friends who can say those speech sounds correctly, but in conversational speech, they get kind of mumbly, they get kind of quiet, they slur everything together, and it's not as crisp and clear as it needs to be. So we have a different therapy approach for that. So those are our speech sound pathways. And then in addition to that, we have kind of a cycles approach where you can go through and target multiple things in a cycle. All right, so those are our speech sound pathways. Okay, we got a question here. So this is a preschooler with echolalia, some phonological processes, language, answering WH questions, and social skills, invades others' personal space and speaks loudly. Yeah, Wanda, that's a good one. Okay, so again, right? They have a lot of areas, especially at these preschool ages. We see that there are so many areas impacted that it's hard to choose which skills we're going to start with. So we really want to think about what is going to impact them the most, what is going to help them make progress the most quickly, right? So for this one, a preschooler with echolalia, if we are seeing that echolalia is really impacting their ability to be understood by others because they're not coming up with like any of their own novel utterances, then that might be where we want to focus so that we can help them with that self-generated speech before we expect them to be able to move on to these other skills. When we're working with echolalia, we often see that these children are Gestalt language processors, meaning that instead of learning language one word at a time, they are learning language in these large chunks, right? They're repeating entire scripts, or they're repeating back what they heard someone else say. And they're not able to generate their own language pieces yet. They can't make their own sentences, right? So if that's the case, then that child is going to struggle to answer WH questions because they don't know how to form their own responses yet. So we really need to work on the echolalia and the Gestalt language processing before they're going to be ready to answer WH questions, right? So unless this is a child where, okay, they have a little bit of echolalia, but they're also making a lot of their own spontaneous speech, then maybe we don't worry about that. But if it was what I'm thinking of echolalia, where it's really pretty dominant, then you would want to work on that before expecting them to be able to answer questions. Because you know what's going to happen if you ask a question to a child with echolalia? They're going to repeat the question, right? Because that's what they do. So definitely look into the Gestalt language processing pathway inside the hub. That would be a good one to start with. Let's see. Phonological processing. Our children who are Gestalt language processors, those first couple of phases, they do have a lot of phonological processes, and the speech sounds are not very clear. And again, we have to get farther along that path of being able to come up with our own self-generated speech before we're able to work on those phonological processes. So again, that might be one to wait on while we get some of that self-generated speech. Okay, and then the other thing you listed were social skills. So getting too close to people, speaking too loudly. And again, this is going to depend on how significant that is to their everyday life. How much is it impacting them? If they are in a class with a whole bunch of other kids that maybe aren't super socially advanced or super socially aware, maybe it's not making a big difference. The other kids don't mind it. But if it's causing problems where they are getting up in kids' faces and the kids don't like it and it's causing lots of meltdowns and they're having to be removed from other children, then it is impacting them, right? And then we can start looking at, okay, yeah, let's work on that in tandem with this echolalia and see if we can help them learn how to generate some speech on their own and also use that language to interact with peers. If they're getting right up in their personal space, maybe it's because they want to play, they want to initiate, but they don't have the words to do it. So could we teach them some gestalts, some scripts that they could use to initiate those interactions in a way that isn't as off-putting to the other child so that they can be more successful in having an interaction, a back and forth with that student. Okay? That was a good one. Thanks, Wanda. Okay, Tondaleo has one. Preschooler who has goals for early phoneme P, B, and M productions. All right. Has minimal initial sounds. Okay, so struggling with initial consonants. Very self-directed, but could use some work on turn taking. Likes to snatch and grab versus waiting and asking. Prefers play-based therapy. Absolutely. Preschoolers, I very rarely do anything besides play-based therapy because preschoolers learn so well through play. They've done studies where, like just telling a kid something versus demonstrating it during play, they learn it infinitely better and retain it longer through play. So always play for this age. Uses LAMP, VOD. So I'm thinking that's a LAMP AAC. Is that what we're talking about? An AAC device? And good receptive skills. Okay, awesome. Voice output device. Got it. Okay, yeah. So I love this. What I'm seeing, if receptive skills are good and is being successful with LAMP, then it sounds like they've got a functional communication system. If they don't have a way to get their basic wants and needs met, I always start there. So if this was a child who is not able to get their wants and needs met, I would start on teaching them the LAMP device and helping them figure out how to get that AAC going so that they do have a way to communicate. But once we've got some basic functional communication for a child like this, then I definitely want to start working on the speech sound production so that they can use those words, use those spoken words to be able to communicate, as well as having that AAC as a backup, right? So what this one sounds like to me is the motor speech pathway. Let's see. Yeah, so you're saying goals for those early sounds, P, B, and M, and initial sounds, initial consonants. A really good way to work on that would be starting with consonant vowel words where it's just one consonant and one vowel. Sorry, my Slack is going crazy. Let's see if I can close that out. All right, so being able to do a consonant vowel word like no or bye, right? So that we're working on just one consonant with one vowel, simplifying the word as much as possible. Or the other way, a vowel and then a consonant like up and on. And we do that in a way that we are teaching them words that are very functional. So on our motor speech pathway, we start off with CV, VC, and CVC words that are functional words they can use throughout their day to actually get wants and needs met, because that's going to give them the biggest impact the fastest, right? So being able to work on those shorter words, and you could, specifically target the ones with PB and M in it if those are the ones that maybe because they're more visual are a little easier for them to produce. And working on using those throughout the day in functional situations. All right, you said he's resistant to imitation, which is fine. That's why we work on it through play, right? So instead of, okay, sit down, let's do this, make it like me, look at my mouth, we're still going to be directing their attention to our mouth if we can, but we are going to be building those sounds into play, right? So let's say we've got some action figures and they're doing different things and we're playing. Our action figure is going to be making those words that we want to model. So let's say we're modeling up, then we're going to take our action figure and go up, up, and we're showing them how we're saying it, but we're doing it in a fun way that maybe they will imitate, right? And we're going to maybe just pick a list of like a couple of words that we want to model over and over and just work it into the play. And then we can create communication temptations where we say, where should he go now? Up, down. And we give them the choice and we ask them. And then say, up. Here we are, up. That has our p sound. Listen, up. Here he goes, up. And so we're making it fun and we're creating the models and we're creating the communication temptations. We're creating opportunities for them to say it too. And if we can get them to kind of, let's say it like this. If we can provide those prompts and get them to try, awesome. But if not, it's still okay to be modeling and providing those temptations because eventually they are going to start to hear it and they are going to start to practice it our way as well. right? Especially if they're having trouble being understood, and we can show them this is how people can understand. And so when they say it, we can say, what was that? Oh, up. I hear the sound on the end, right? And so that, especially if they've got good receptive skills, they're going to figure that out. They're going to go, oh, I guess I got to say it that way. And they're going to try. They're going to want to try. But it takes making it fun, and it takes building those relationships and making sure that you have the patience to keep trying, right? Sounds good. I feel I'm on the right track. What can I provide parent for carryover? Oh, great question. So especially with the motor speech pathway, the more they say those words over and over and over and over again, the more likely they are to retain them, because that's how motor speech works, is we have to reprogram the brain to get that pathway going. And so for parent carryover, I would pick like 4, maybe 5 of those words that you want them to target at home that are either consonant vowel, vowel consonant, or consonant vowel consonant. And they're in the motor pathway if you want to grab that out of the hub. And you just say, okay, these are the words I want you guys to practice this week. Just anytime you can work these into anything. I want you to, remind them that we say it like this, up, and really emphasize the P. You could give them some little fun play activities like, do it like this, or just, here we go. We're going to put our hands up. So just having them work those words into whatever they're doing throughout the day, that's going to be much less cumbersome to a parent than having to sit down and try to get them to say words, which might not work. If it's a child who will sit down and practice words at home, then that's a great way too, is, okay, we're going to say your words 5 times in the morning and 5 times in the afternoon. But if not, working it into the day would be good as well. But yeah, keep the number small so that it's manageable for a parent, because, we've got a billion other things we're trying to keep track of as well. And if you can send home a little page that's got the words on it, that's even better. All right. You're welcome. Okay, those were great. I am going to wrap it up because we are at 30 minutes, and I like to keep these to 30 minutes. But thank you for all of you who came and watched. And again, don't forget, if you would like to access our framework, our screening checklist, our progress monitoring tools, all of that, including our podcast recordings, are available on the free membership inside the hub. So go to hub.speechandlanguagekids.com, and you can sign up for the free plan and get access to all of these resources and at least get you started. And then if you do want to get the therapy materials, like we were talking about, the specific pathways or the CVC words, any of those things, all of the materials you do have to pay for. It's $25 a month or $250 a year, but that gives you access to all of our materials and our courses inside the hub as well. So come check out the free stuff at least, and then join us on the discussion board. You can ask questions, and I'd be happy to guide you towards which pathways make the most sense for which children, which areas are we looking at, all of that. I know there's a lot that goes into it, and I want you guys to feel comfortable and confident making these choices about how do we start, how do we get going with a child, and how do we help them have the most impact in their communication skills as possible. All right. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you on our next episode of the Speech and Language Kids podcast. Bye for now.